Before we dive in, please subscribe to the channel and make sure to watch this video until the very end for some incredible insights. You won't want to miss this.
Walter Hargrove had trimmed the roses along the reception hall for 6 years, and nobody at Colton Manor had ever asked his name. Tonight he wore his only good jacket, the one with a small tear near the cuff. He stood at the edge of the tent, watching a wedding begin that he had waited a long time to see. He was not sure anyone would let him stay. Walter Hargrove had trimmed the roses along the reception hall for 6 years, and nobody at Colton Manor had ever asked his name. He was the man who fixed the sprinklers before sunrise. He was the man who patched the fence after storms. Brides in white dresses walked past him on the garden path 100 times, and not one of them had looked at his face. Tonight was different, and Walter knew at the moment he put on his one good jacket. The jacket was navy, plain, a little worn at the cuff. He had bought it 11 years ago, back when he still wore suits every day, back when people stood up when he walked into a room. He did not tell anyone that anymore. It was easier to let people believe what they wanted. Tonight, Colton Manor was hosting the wedding of Emily Colton, and Walter had been invited. Not as staff. As a guest. He had known Emily since she was 6 years old, sitting on the porch steps of a small house 2 towns over, watching her mother cry at a kitchen table. That house was long gone now. So was the man who had almost taken it from them. Walter had stopped that, quietly, the way he stopped most things. Nobody in this tent remembered it. Nobody except one woman, and she had asked him here herself. He straightened his collar and walked toward the light. The tent glowed gold under 100 small bulbs strung between white beams. Guests in silk and pressed suits laughed near tall glasses of champagne. A jazz trio played something soft near the dance floor. Walter stood at the edge of it all, feeling the grass under his old dress shoes, feeling very much like a man standing at the wrong door. A young woman in a server's uniform hurried past him with a tray. She paused. "Sir, the gardener's entrance is around back," she said, not unkindly. "If you're here to check the hedges before the toasts." "I'm a guest," Walter said. She blinked, glanced at his jacket, at the small tear near the cuff, and offered an apologetic smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Of course. Sorry. There's a seating chart by the arch." Walter thanked her and moved on. He was used to this. He had been mistaken for staff at this venue more times than he could count, and for 6 years, he had never corrected anyone. It was simpler that way. A man raking leaves draws no attention. A man once addressed as, "Your Honor," draws entirely too much. He found his name near the back of the chart, seated at table 14, farthest from the arch where the ceremony would soon begin. He did not mind. He had learned long ago that where you sit says less about your worth than people believe. At table 14 sat an older couple from out of town, a cousin of the groom, and a teenage girl scrolling through her phone. Walter took his seat and folded his hands. "You work here?" the teenage girl asked, not looking up. "I used to." "Figures," she muttered, and went back to her phone. He let it go. Some things were not worth explaining, especially to a girl of 16 who had likely never been told no in her life. Walter recognized her now. Sophie Colton, the groom's younger sister. He had seen her running through the garden as a child, back before the family added a second story to their pride. The ceremony began, and for a while, Walter forgot about the seating chart entirely. Emily walked down the aisle in a dress the color of morning fog, and Walter felt something rise in his chest that surprised him. He had not expected to feel this much. He had told himself he was only coming to watch her happy, to close a door quietly and go home. But watching her walk toward the man she loved, Walter thought of another wedding, decades ago, in a much smaller room with far fewer flowers. He thought of a young woman named Margaret Colton standing at an altar with hope on her face and very little money in her pocket. He thought of the promise he had made to her, once, that he never spoke of again. Nobody here knew that promise. Not even Emily. After the vows, after the applause, after the first dance had ended and the band shifted into something livelier, Walter carried his empty water glass toward the refreshment table. That was when Richard Colton found him. Richard was the groom's father, a broad man in a gray suit that fit a little too well, the kind of man who had built 3 car dealerships from nothing and never let anyone forget it. He had a voice made for boardrooms, loud enough to fill any room he entered. "You," Richard said, snapping his fingers once, the way a man might call a waiter. "There's a wobble in the head table. 3rd chair from the left. Can you take a look before the toasts?" Walter set down his glass. "I'm a guest at this wedding, Mr. Colton." Richard's eyes moved over him, over the plain jacket, the modest shoes, the quiet posture of a man who did not raise his voice to prove anything. "A guest," Richard repeated, not quite believing it. "Whose guest?" "Margaret's." Something flickered across Richard's face, gone as quickly as it came. "Well. The chair still wobbles." He walked off before Walter could answer, already greeting a business partner near the bar with a booming laugh, already forgetting the man he had just dismissed. Walter looked down at his own hands for a moment. They were steadier now than they had been 30 years ago, on his first day behind the bench, when a young courtroom clerk had to remind him twice to breathe. He walked to the head table and fixed the chair anyway. It took him under a minute. Old habits, old hands, still useful even when nobody was watching. A guest nearby, an elderly woman in pearls, noticed the quick, precise motion of his hands. "You do that like you've done it 1,000 times, she said, smiling. "Something like that," Walter answered. He did not explain that his precision came from 30 years of writing rulings that could not afford a single careless word. Some habits simply stayed in the hands, long after the courtroom was gone. By the time the first toasts began, Walter had returned to table 14, where the teenage girl, Sophie, was still on her phone. "You're the gardener, right?" she asked again, this time with a small laugh in her voice, like she was testing a joke on her friends in a group chat. "I used to garden here," Walter said. "That much is true. My dad says you probably live in your truck." Walter almost smiled. "Almost. I have a house, if that matters to you." "Whatever," Sophie said, and went back to her screen, already bored of him. He let her words settle and pass through him without taking root. He had learned, long before this girl was born, that judgment says far more about the one giving it than the one receiving it. The best man's toast ended in laughter and clinking glasses. The band played on. And near the edge of the tent, Margaret Colton, the bride's mother, finally found him. She was 61 now, her dark hair streaked with silver, her eyes the same as they had been 30 years ago, tired but unbroken. "Walter," she said softly, sitting beside him. "I saw what Richard said to you." "It's nothing, Margaret." "It's not nothing." Her voice trembled slightly. "You saved this family once. And my husband treats you like hired help at our daughter's wedding." Walter shook his head gently. "I chose this, Margaret. Nobody made me quiet. I did that myself." "Why?" she asked. "You could have told them who you are. Any of them. All these years." Walter looked out at the golden tent, at the laughter, at a life that had been rebuilt from nothing. "Maybe I hid too much," he admitted quietly. "I let people believe what they wanted, so I wouldn't have to explain myself again. Maybe that wasn't fair to you. Or to Emily." Margaret took his hand. "Will you at least come sit closer? For the last toast?" Walter hesitated, then nodded. She led him toward the head table, past Richard, who frowned but said nothing, past guests who whispered without quite knowing why. Margaret pulled out an empty chair near her own seat, at the family's table. Walter looked at it for a long moment. "Sir," he said quietly to Richard, who stood nearby with a tightening jaw, "may I sit here?" The tent went quiet. It was only 10 seconds, maybe 15, but it felt far longer. Guests near the head table stopped mid-conversation. Sophie looked up from her phone for the first time all night. Even the band seemed to hold its note a beat longer than usual. Nobody explained anything. Walter simply sat, folded his hands the way he always did, and waited. For the next half-minute, nobody spoke. Whispers moved through nearby tables like a current, uncertain, curious, unanswered. Who is that? Why is Margaret holding his hand? Why did Richard just go quiet? It was Emily who broke the silence, walking toward the head table in her wedding dress, eyes wide. "Mom," she said carefully. "Who is this?" Margaret took a breath. "Emily, this is Judge Walter Hargrove." The word judge moved through the tent like a small wave. "Judge?" Sophie repeated, phone forgotten completely now. "Retired," Walter said simply. "For 11 years. Richard's face had gone pale, then red, then something quieter and harder to name. "You're the judge who handled the dealership case. Colton versus Fairview Bank." "I was. That was 30 years ago," Richard said. "Before I even married into this family." "It was," Walter agreed. "Before your time, Richard. But not before Margaret's." Margaret's voice was steady now, though her eyes were bright. "Before I married your father, Emily, there was a man who tried to take our home. Foreclosure, forged paperwork, a bank that thought a young widow with a small daughter wouldn't fight back." Emily's hand rose slowly to her mouth. "Judge Hargrove didn't just rule on the case," Margaret continued. "He looked at every document twice, found what the bank had hidden, and gave us 6 more months to prove the fraud ourselves. We wouldn't have had a home without him. I wouldn't have had anything to build a life on. And after that," Walter added quietly, "the case was appealed. I recused myself so it could be handled fairly by someone with no history with your mother. I couldn't take credit for what came after. I only helped her get a fair second look." Richard sat down slowly in the chair beside him, staring, the boardroom confidence gone from his face entirely. "You've been cutting our grass for 6 years, he said, almost to himself. "I like gardens," Walter said. "And I liked being near this family, even quietly. Margaret asked me to keep an eye on things after her first husband passed. I never wanted a title for it." "I told you to fix a wobbly chair," Richard said, voice hollow. "I snapped my fingers at you." "You did," Walter said, without anger. "It was still a good chair, once it was fixed." A few guests near the table let out a nervous, disbelieving laugh, quickly hushed. It was Sophie who spoke next, her voice smaller than before, stripped of the confidence she had carried all evening. "I told him he probably lived in his truck," she said, eyes wet. "I called him the gardener like it was an insult." She looked at Walter directly for the first time all night. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't even try to know." "You're 16, Walter said gently. "You have plenty of time to learn what I took far too long to teach myself. That a man's worth was never in his jacket." Sophie nodded, wiping her eyes quickly before anyone could see. Richard cleared his throat, still shaken. "Judge Hargrove, I owe you an apology. A real one. Not just for tonight." "You owe me nothing, Richard," Walter said. "You worked hard for everything you built. Sometimes hard work makes a man forget how far a small kindness can travel. That's not a crime. It's just something worth remembering." Emily knelt beside Walter's chair, still in her wedding dress, and took his weathered hand in both of hers. "You've been part of my family longer than I knew," she said. "Thank you for never needing anyone to know it." "I got to watch you grow up from the garden path," Walter said. That was payment enough. The band, sensing the moment, began to play something softer. Margaret raised her glass, and after a beat, so did Richard, and then Emily, and slowly the entire tent full of strangers who had never learned his name. "To Judge Walter Hargrove," Margaret said, her voice breaking only slightly. "Who fixed more than chairs around here." Glasses lifted. Walter, uncomfortable with attention even now, simply nodded once and looked down at his hands. Later that night, as guests danced and the tent glowed warmer under starlight, Walter walked the garden path one more time, the same path he had walked with rakes and shears for 6 quiet years. Sophie found him there, sitting on a bench near the roses. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course. Why didn't you ever tell anyone? All this time?" Walter considered the question carefully, the way he once considered every question that mattered. "Titles change how people look at you," he said. "I spent 30 years being looked at for what I was, not who I was. When I retired, I wanted, just once, to be looked past. To be ordinary. It turns out ordinary has its own kind of peace." Sophie sat beside him quietly. "I judged you before I knew any of that." "Most people do," Walter said. "The trick isn't stopping them from judging. It's not needing them to stop, before you decide who you are." They sat in silence for a moment, the music drifting faintly from the tent. "The table never changed," Walter said finally, almost to himself. "The people looking at it did." Sophie looked at him, then out at the tent glowing gold in the dark, full of people who had spent one evening learning that dignity rarely announces itself. "I won't forget that," she said. "Good," Walter said. "That's really all I ever wanted."
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments how it made you feel. I'll see you in the next one.